everybody, I'm Belle Holder, the host of UNCTAD Conversations. Today, we're in the capital city of Barbados, that's Bridgetown, and we got away from the hustle and bustle of it all to come here to the Church Village Green. It's a lovely park that has an amphitheater, a fish pond, and a nod to Barbados' history. Just west of the Church Village Green, you'll find the Central Bank of Barbados and the historic Masonic Lodge, which dates back to the 1800s. There, you'll find the Exchange Museum, which is a place of discovery and mystery. Let's go check it out. Here at the Exchange Museum, you can learn so much about the history of business, trade, and commerce in Barbados. Well, today's guest is laser focused on the future of trade and development in this small island developing state. Our conversation with His Excellency, Ambassador Chad Blackman, is straight ahead. When you were just 24 years old, you won the first ever award for outstanding work as a CARICOM Youth Ambassador. The award was for your contribution to socio-economic landscape of Barbados on a national level, regionally and internationally. And the award was presented by then Prime Minister Owen Arthur. Can you recall for us some of that work that you had done as a CARICOM Youth Ambassador?
Absolutely. One of the things that I was involved with at that time, whilst working with other youth ambassadors in the region, was to really champion the cause of the CARICOM single market and economy. Now, of course, coincidentally, he was the Prime Minister who had to take that charge as well. And over that time, I was able to really, first of all, understand the importance of regionalism to Barbados and to the entire Caribbean. Second of all, the importance that trade plays in everything that we do. And as a result of that, it then grew a passion for me to really understand international trade. Later I went on and did law and the Masters in International Trade Law. But come full circle, being Barbados's representative to the World Trade Organization, for example, that period of time in my life has really allowed for me to see the full picture and to be able to carry the interests and aspirations of Barbados. Because let's face it, the international community is very diverse, it's very complex. The rules constantly change, and you always have to have an eye on one side of the things. What are the interests of your country? And two, where is the international community going? And how do you meet in between, whilst at the same time not compromising? So that period of time played a very pivotal role in my life when I certainly was youth ambassador.
Yeah, you worked in, and as you just said, you worked in the international development sector and focused on trade law for about 15 years. You were not yet 40 years old. No, and I'm sharing this on purpose. How old were you when you passed the bar?
We're talking about, well, late 2014 is when I actually finished my law studies. Right. But in terms of development studies and development practice, I was doing it from probably the age of 22, 23. Right. Is it? So it has been a long time coming. You've now dated me on public, but that is fine.
I did it on purpose because what I'm doing is I'm establishing a level of commitment, a level of drive, and I want young people in Barbados to see this and to say, he did what, and he's how old, and he's been able to achieve what, and he's working at what level, because I want them to be able to envision it for themselves.
Absolutely.
And that's why I'm asking that question. So what drives you?
You know, it's funny you ask that. What drives me are a number of things, but principally I would say ensuring that I make a change before I leave this earth. It's that simple. Ensuring that whenever history is reflected upon, that people can say, given the resources placed before him, that Chad Blackman would have impacted not just the lives of person that he knew, but also those that he did not know. And that's why for me, the opportunity now to serve Barbados at this level is so important, because the reality is, when you're in Geneva or you're in Vienna and you're championing a lot of issues in the international organizations, you don't only represent the country. Many times you hold committees of different international organizations. And therefore you carry the aspirations of 194 other countries as well. For a small country to be able to do that is a very humbling thing. And going back to your question, that is part of the legacy that I want to leave, so that my daughter can look on when I'm gone, and her kids and their grandkids, they can say that their grandfather would have been able to influence something in the world, whether it be trade policy or simply ensuring that the quality of life for those around the world was improved.
Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned your daughter. She's 9 years old now.
Yes, Paige.
And I came across an interesting quote from you around education. And you said, education is not a commodity, but a fundamental human right. Tell us, expand on that quote for us in terms of your focus around education and access.
No, simply put, it goes back to even what you said before. Because of education, like so many other Barbadians, I was able to access many things in the world, not just a career, but a new perspective, a different perspective. And if Barbados and the Caribbean, small and developing states, if we're meant to catapult into being world-class citizens and being dominant in the fields that we pursue, whether it be sports, arts, theater, music, finance, education has to get at the core. Because, and I'm not just talking about certification, but understanding how the world works, equally marrying that with who we are, and then bridging the two to come up with an outcome in the interest of our people. When I come back to the whole aspect of it being a right, without education, Barbados is not really where we are today. And therefore, we have to, one, guard it as a right, and two, with rights come responsibilities. Yeah. And therefore, you just can't say you have a right to education. You also have to ensure that when you get that education, you empower yourself and those around you as you go forward. And those are the things that I think that we have to really hold dear. And as a result of that, we have to really ensure that the young Barbadians coming up today appreciate the education that we have. Unfortunately, there are many countries in the world who don't have quality education or even free education at the point of delivery. And we are very fortunate. But as I said, we mustn't take it for granted what we have. It is too important, if I should use that now, a commodity to waste. We have to really cherish it.
Yes. Are you writing? And I'm asking that question because I remember years ago having a conversation with the former Prime Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Mitchell, and who's written several books, and he was saying more Caribbean leaders need to write, and he felt that what often happens is we don't write our own stories, and someone else comes along afterwards and write the stories for us. And he was saying, more Caribbean leaders need to write their own stories. I know that Prime Minister Owen Arthur would have been in the process of writing before he passed. He wasn't able to complete it before his death. Are you writing? Are you putting out something that maybe we were able to get our hands on within the next few years?
Well, to answer you, I will tell you yes. When I do find the time between work, I try to put my thoughts together. Actually, I'm working on something that I think will be a benefit to the Caribbean and small and developing states, focusing on trade and development in a post-COVID-19 environment. And I think that the lessons over the last year and a half in particular has allowed us to see, or should allow us to see, that the vulnerabilities and the inequalities that we face are in many instances inherent. But the question is, how do we respond to them? How do we use what we have, whether it be our missions abroad, in championing the issues of our countries? Because if we don't articulate our position and fervently and consistently, no one will do it for us. And there's too much at stake for small countries like Barbados. If we don't articulate our positions, build partnerships with other countries of different sizes, of different regions, we will continue then to have a development prospect that does not live up to our true potential. And I think that's why Prime Minister Motley consistently said that Barbados must be a country that is known for its excellence in everything that we do. It is not easy. The world that we live in today is very complex. There's not a fair balance around the world. But what do? You fight. And by fight, I don't mean the physical fight, but you use your intellectual rigor, married by your passion and your culture, and you start to craft a narrative and instill it from the youngest child right up. Where do you want Barbados in the region to go? How do you get there? What are the resources that you need to do, whether it be technical, financial, social, and build? And it goes back to that question of education that you said. If you can enlighten people to see that there's more than what meets the eye, and there's more than what you can actually thinking that you can achieve, believe me, the results are endless.
Yes. Okay, we're going to continue this conversation right after this short break. Stay with us on UNCTAD Conversations. We'll be right back. Welcome back to UNCTAD Conversations. Just recently, Prime Minister Motley, delivered her speech at the UN General Assembly, and it got some attention, and it got international attention.
And today, Barbados calls at this dangerous fork in the road that the nation states of this assembly and the people of this world must indicate what direction we want our world to go in, and not leave it to the faceless few who have worked so hard to prevent the prosperity from being shared that is sufficient in this world, from being shared with all of our people.
One of the things that I came away with after listening to what she said is that she challenged everyone in the room to step up and get past lip service and move to a position of action. What was your response to her speech?
Well, obviously, I'm in full agreement with what she said. The time for the international community, large countries, small countries, wealthy nations, poorer nations, companies, civil society, the entire global community, the time for us to just articulate what the issue is or issues are is long past. How do you move it from narrative to action, as you said? Mm-hmm. And therefore, once you can have that clarion call, which you really did, you're right. A number of my colleagues, particularly in Geneva and around the world, when she gave her speech, they invariably said, that is what we needed to hear. Additionally, that is what we need to do. And I think it was even more timely, particularly given the fact that we're on the verge of having UNCTAD 15 in a few days, to have that days prior, when she herself will be the president of UNCTAD for 4 years, being the world leader who will be championing all issues of trade and development. I don't think we could have scripted that in a history book. But, as I said, with rights comes responsibilities. And the responsibility of the international community now, more than ever, must be how, first of all, do we ensure that inequalities that existed even before COVID-19, that they are now addressed? How do we ensure that the vulnerabilities of developing nations, particularly smaller and developing states, are treated to so that the capacity of these countries can be built? And thirdly, and importantly, how do we ensure that it is done in a timely fashion, in a sustainable fashion, having indicators and timelines set up? Because many times we have targets, but if we don't have a timeline supported and buttressed by the necessary resources to do so, you spin top in mud. And the Prime Minister must be commended for it. And I'm not just saying so because she's our Prime Minister, but the world has really responded to that. Whether it be the traditional media, social media, in the corridors of diplomacy, people are talking about it. And therefore, every Barbadian, for example, must also do their part to see, for example, how do we address the issues of climate change? Yes, a lot of it has to be policy-driven at the national and international level, but consumers, day-to-day consumers, must also demand more from private sector companies to ensure that the goods and services that they produce are sustainable. What is the impact that it's having on the environment? So it's a whole of society, whole of the world approach. If you really listen to what she said, that must take place.
Yeah. When we look at some of the issues, the world issues that Barbados is also facing that needs to be addressed, you check some of the key boxes in terms of international development, trade, shipping, data protection.
Yes.
Let's focus on data protection for a minute.
Yes.
Because definitely if COVID has done nothing else, is definitely forced everyone online. So anybody who was even resistant to engaging further with technology, you've been forced to. If you want to develop your career further, you've been forced to, or your education, look at more technology.
Yes.
Where is Barbados in terms of data protection, especially since we are also getting ready to do the electronic identification cards as well?
Yes. No, it's funny you asked that. In a previous dispensation, actually just before I started being ambassador, I would have specialized in private on the area of data protection, went across the region treating to that. And it's very timely because credit has to be given to the government. Even before COVID-19 and even before the heightened demand for going online now, the government had focused on the Data Protection Act, which brings Barbados into the 21st century reality of data protection, because countries around the world are ensuring that their consumers are protected. Why? Data has a very high value. Second of all, the privacy of individuals and their content is very critical. And when you talk about international trade, when you go online and you purchase a good or a service from across the world, your data is stored somewhere in the world. And how you then treat or how countries or companies treat your data is important. You want to know who is accessing it, for what purpose, for how long, what is the criteria they're using to access it. And bringing that back to Barbados, it's very, very timely that we did that even before COVID. COVID has heightened, as I said, the importance of that. And when you bring it to entrepreneurs, as you mentioned, we have to get our young people into being businessmen and women, whether small, large, or medium. But the new age of business requires them to now shift the mindset, not just having a brick and mortar business, but more and more, as we've seen over the last year and a half in particular, shifting that into an online reality. It will therefore require our entrepreneurs, our businessmen, establishing to really come to grips with the realities of data protection. You can no longer just store person's information haphazardly. That is something that's very critical. But it also sets Barbados apart as one of the countries in the world that is prepared to do business at the highest levels. And for a foreign investor looking to come into Barbados, particularly from our traditional business partners or business partners around the world, these are parts of the tools and criteria that they look for. And you tick that box. And therefore, Barbados is well ahead. But we must also encourage other developing countries to do so.
Right. So why do we often hear it's so difficult to do business in Barbados? There's so much bureaucracy and so much red tape. Why do we hear that so often?
Well, I think it happens for a number of reasons. First of all, it's not something that has been happening only recently, but it's taking some time to address. But the government has been making massive efforts to ensure that is sorted. Because why? If you can sort your ease of doing business, you go up higher on the index, you attract more business internationally. But it's not just about attracting international business. You also have a domestic population of which you have to serve. And part and parcel of the government's responsibility, which they're taking very seriously, is to ensure that the average Barbadian can do business. So when you look at things, for example, in terms of the licenses and the new ID cards that you would have mentioned, instead of having to go and collect it, you have it being posted. There are different things. So that you marry technology with the purpose of the service of what you're trying to achieve, and ensuring that the consumer, the public, can actually enjoy what they're trying to get. And that is part of the role of government, to ensure that there's a whole of government approach so that the consumers can maximize their time and receive a quality good and service.
So how do we move those entrepreneurs and those individuals who have subsistent business incomes into the formal sector and not be afraid? Because I think that's part of it. Yeah. Sometimes they're afraid in terms of even how they'll be taxed and the cost of doing business to move on to these new platforms.
Yeah. You've hit the nail on the head. A lot of what has to happen is also a number of conversations. And I don't just mean only formal conversations, but the government, private sector, civil society has to now create a national environment where young people can come forward and get information, be groomed, mentored into how these things work. A lot of it, of course, takes place. You don't have to start from scratch. But how do you intensify the effort and make it more streamlined in ensuring that these young people can, as you said, move from the informal into the formal? Because let's face it, there are a lot of ideas in Barbados that are incredibly, incredibly good. And we were talking about trade. Young people now live in an age where 20, 30 years ago, their ideas would be met with a barrier. Why? Because there wasn't the internet. There wasn't the social media. There wasn't all of the different platforms that they have. But we now have to create an environment that helps them to pivot these ideas into exportable ideas, backed by intellectual property. And this is where then there has to be a whole of a society approach, helping them to become world-class producers of ideas. I'm sure, believe me, I'm sure that in this country, there are people who have ideas that can bring billions of foreign exchange into this country. The idea that only countries in the north have the intellectual repository of all ideas, that is a myth.
Right.
For Barbados to be the country that produced and invented rum, the best cricketer in the world, now the top international singer in the world, is in our DNA. The country
And
does.
actually, to describe her as just a singer now is to not focus on everything else that
She's an
doing.
icon. She's
Correct.
a tycoon. She's a businesswoman. She's everything.
Yeah.
And you're absolutely right. So therefore, we have it in our DNA. But then, how do you use those success stories to
Right.
translate that and inspire every child born and unborn to become literally world class? Going back to the Prime Minister's vision.
Right. Okay. So when we come back, I want you to take us into one of those rooms at the UN and take us into the boardroom in Geneva. We want to be a fly on the wall and understand how it actually works. We'll be right back. Take us into the boardroom, if you will, and give us a sense of what it's like on a day-to-day basis in terms of what you're charged with.
Yeah. Well, first of all, no 2 days are the same. And I think that's one of the things that I like about this role. You can, for example, go from being in the World Trade Organization in a meeting, driving over across the city to the World Health Organization, and then you leave there, you go to the UN Human Rights Council, all different subject areas, all different interests. But the core interest amongst all of them is that you're representing Barbados' interests in these theaters. Part of that, though, requires that you, of course, work with other countries, because the interests of Barbados may not necessarily be the interests of another member state or group of member states. And it therefore calls for you to then use your diplomacy skills, your human interaction skills, persuasion, in trying to ensure that you can ensure that Barbados' interests is advanced.
That's where the attorney comes in.
Well, part of it, yes. But I also must tell you, it's also about personal relationships. And what I've found over the last 3 years is that the personal relationships that you have outside of the formal context helps the country when you go into the formal negotiations as well. Because you build a rapport with your colleagues, and it makes things a lot easier. But even more important than the personal relationships is the sense of trust. Barbados's name historically as a country has also been very strong. But I must tell you that over the last 3 years, whenever Barbados takes a microphone, whether it be in the World Trade Organization or any other forum, people listen. And it's not because Ambassador Blackman. Of course, I help with that. But I must tell you, it's as a result of the anchor that we have here in Bridgetown, Prime Minister Motley. Her reputation is incredibly strong. And it makes diplomacy a lot more easier when we do that. And because of it, people look to Barbados for leadership. I remember, I must tell you, we were having a reception about a year and a half ago. And one of the ambassadors remarked, he said, if I didn't know any better, I would swear that you are the size of at least a continent. And I kid you not. And as I was going home and I reflected upon it, I think what lends to that sort of thinking is that what Kofi Annan said, Barbados punches above its weight. And the projection that we give as a country is not that we're small and hopeless. Yes, we have our challenges and vulnerabilities, but size will not determine our influence. Size will not determine how far we aspire or what we aspire to. And that has to be the message, as I said, that every young Barbadian, and also those who are older, who are we? What is our core value? What is our belief? Are we afraid of the world? No. Looking at the whole David and Goliath analogy, I like to liken Barbados to David. He slayed the Goliath, the different Goliaths you may want to consider, talking about the international realities. But then David moved from being that, he became king. And when you liken that to the aspiration that the Prime Minister talks about, when Barbados being world class in whatever it does, it really speaks to the fact that there's nothing that can stop Barbados from being a powerful world class country. Nothing.
Right. I lived in Canada for half of my life, and I mean, in terms of being an immigrant, so you're in a new country, which eventually also became part of who I am as well. But often, sometimes you would, and before I say that, I largely had a positive experience. Absolutely. And occasionally you would meet people who question who you are or your accent, for example. And I would say to people, but you also have an accent and understand something. I speak with an accent, I don't think with an accent.
Yes.
And that means a lot to me. It meant a lot to me then, and it means a lot to me now. So, and another question I have for you is, in terms of our position in the region, what can you do or speak to about more regional integration?
Well, I would simply say, as you can imagine, it's first of all necessary. Uh, I'm heartened that Barbados continues to play a very critical role in the CARICOM single market and economy. We have Ambassador David Commission, who's doing an excellent job in terms of championing our interests, of course, supported by our leader, who is leading in that regard. But the people, we focus a lot on policy, which is necessary, which is the architecture. But within that architecture, the people have to drive and demand what do they want CARICOM to look like, what benefits they want to have at their disposal. We have a rich culture in the region. Our creative industry sector is second to none in the world. But how do we take that from being just a cultural sector, but being an engine of major growth, again, backed by intellectual property, that redounds to the benefit of our people? And if we can start to do that in a way that allows for the young boy or girl who may not necessarily be mathematically or French, let's say, inclined, but they have a skill set in culture, we will start to see gains. But I also want to touch on that thing that I also just mentioned, French, languages. The Caribbean citizen of today and tomorrow has to be one that is multilingual. I say that again. The Caribbean citizen of today and tomorrow has to be one that is multilingual. Whether you want to be a footballer, whether you want to be an architect, a businessman, a lawyer, a nurse, our competitive advantage has to be that our people can speak and converse anywhere they go in the world. And once you can start to do that, then our region as a collective will become a very competitive region.
Yes. You, in your position, what you do is so visible and so prominent, which means everyone's watching. Everybody's very sensitive about costs and budgets right now for obvious reasons, because a pandemic is expensive. There was a recent publication about the overseas missions and the ambassadors, and they published salaries and costs for these overseas offices. When you see reports like that, how do you react? Like, how do you feel?
Yeah, thank you. No, I actually heard about the article, and at first glance, when I looked at it, I said, but it doesn't really paint the entire picture. And sometimes when you read something in a snapshot, you miss the context, and I'll explain. Most of the missions in Geneva, for example, just Geneva alone, have staff, for example, of at least 200-300 per mission. Because why? There are tons of institutions that you have to cover. Barbados has a very, very, very small staff, one of the smallest in Geneva. But yet our staff, we have to multitask. So instead of one person specializing only focusing on WTO, you then have to ask staff to cover 10. It is incredibly tough. We get the job done. Because why? The interests of Barbadians at home are at stake. But it goes further than that. I must tell you, particularly having been working in this role for the last 3 years, our missions were incredibly hard. Not just now, for a long time, as long as this country has had foreign missions abroad. And really, I think really the question is not how much they're being paid, but simply that it has to be sharing with the public. Once you share with the public what you're doing, whether it be through social media or interviews like this, then the public will know what is going on. But I can tell you a lot is being done on their behalf.
Right.
Every trade negotiation, you have the mission there. When you're not there at the table, you can't influence policy. So let's look at it. Barbados is hosting UNCTAD 15. Why? Because our mission in Geneva, backed by the support of Prime Minister Molly, was able to negotiate and lobby member states for us to host it. And then, as I said, for the next 3 years, we are going to be able to influence global trade and global development policy.
Yeah.
Had we not been there, it couldn't happen.
In our final 30 seconds, are there any other details that you would like to add?
I would simply say to Barbadians and to everyone who is hearing my voice now, whether you are from a small country or you're from a small family, large or rich, it doesn't matter. What you need is a simple or two ingredients: ambition and commitment. And once you can combine those two, there's nothing that can stop you from achieving at the highest levels. And I really think that That is the message that I really want to drive forward.
Right. Thank you so very much for joining
You're
us.
welcome.
Thank you. And thank you too for joining us for this episode of UNCTAD Conversations. I'm Belle Holder. Bye.